That is the most Chinese thing since tucking your shirt into your underpants. It is so smart. Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. Even in my gun-positive county, Kentucky Fried Chicken employees almost never report to work strapped up with a submachine gun on a one-point sling. That would be really cool, and I would totally go and buy a bucket of the Colonel's Original just to see that. But if you'd been at KFC in Shanghai in 2007, you could have seen that for free. However, the circumstances were horrifying. A young mother took her 4-year-old daughter Min Min from a doctor's visit, where Min Min had been a very brave little girl, and they went to a big mall for a special lunch. These were working people, and they occupied a pretty crappy rung on Shanghai's economic ladder, so they didn't normally have a lot of money to blow at fancy shopping malls. But today, Min Min really deserved something special and fun. And this was one of those stores that had a cool kids' playland inside. So after their lunch, Min Min was in the back of the store playing on the jungle gym, and Mom was watching nearby, and she saw a man in a red shirt that looked kind of like a KFC uniform approach the play area. Next thing anyone knew, the man was grabbing Min Min with one hand, and he had a knife in the other, and he was saying, "I want chicken." Police were called, and the man was offered chicken, but he didn't eat it. In fact, he didn't move. He didn't say anything to the police or anyone else. He didn't answer questions. He just took his poor little captive and withdrew with her into the play structure, and they sat there at the top of the slide under this little roof. Outside, the police cordoned off the area. They set up a perimeter, and they tried everything that they could think of to talk to the hostage taker and learn who he was, what he might possibly want. Was he a terrorist? They're not rare in China. Did he have demands? Was he a madman? They actually broadcast his image all over the city, asking people for information, hoping that maybe a friend or a relative of the hostage taker would make themselves known and help police talk him out of the jungle gym. But nobody could identify this guy. Unbeknownst to police, the kidnapper was this unmedicated hemorrhoid on the body politic named Tong. Even though he was on the wrong side of 40, he was still unmarried and unemployed, which is to say, in Chinese terms, he was dangerously marginal. Friends, ever since the Bronze Age in China, where there's crime, brigandage, or rebellion, it usually starts with jobless, unmarried, horny guys. In the Chinese tradition of governance, when men don't have wives and dependents and duties to keep them moored in the community, that's considered a risky amount of human energy to have floating around unchanneled, like somebody on a United flight starting a chainsaw in the economy cabin. It might turn out okay, but that doesn't mean that it's sound risk management. Well, this scumbag Tong, he was a case study in that type of dangerously solitary, dislocated man that Chinese authorities are traditionally fearful of. He was this deadbeat who sponged off his little old mother, glowered at his neighbors around the apartment complex, and he began by trying his hand at petty crimes like scalping tickets. Then he escalated to feuding with what you could think of as like the local HOA, Homeowners Association. And this turned into some rivalry that ended with him trying to set somebody's apartment door on fire. For that, he got a year and a half in a Chinese jail, which would sure as hell scare me straight. In my day, people came out of Chinese jails as hollow-eyed, wheezing, malnourished wrecks who couldn't say boo to a goose. But this guy must have been a hard case. When Tong got out, he wasn't done yet. He actually went and stabbed a volunteer from the local police auxiliary. For that, he got 15 days of detention, which doesn't make any sense to me unless that's code for 15 days in a wet hole somewhere, pissing blood while you're getting beaten with a padded 2x4 that leaves no marks. The one that I saw of these had been helpfully sewn up in an attractive beach towel by one of the cop wives, like a sort of gaily colored truncheon cozy. Well, whatever did or didn't happen to this dirtbag in detention did not make him more pro-social, because here he was now, escalating to an offense that was many times worse. But as this standoff was occurring, police still didn't know any of this. To them, the perpetrator remained a complete cipher, and all they knew about him was what they could see with their own eyes. A dangerous man holding a knife to the throat of this child. And the only thing that he'd said to anyone was when he blurted out, "I want chicken." That was all. And when they brought him food, he didn't touch it. When the negotiators tried to form some kind of rapport with him, they got nothing from him. He might already have had some inklings that he was losing control of the tactical situation. He probably suspected that the police, in trying to form conversations with him, were just beginning to slowly set him up somehow. And they were. Granted, they were doing it very slowly and patiently in ways that were pretty weird. Like early in the standoff, a crew arrived at the store's main entrance and they wheeled in a couple of big planters, like those big potted office ferns. And also, police officers came into the store holding big bouquets of flowers for him. Reportedly, the purpose of this was twofold. The police wanted to bring in some flowers to lighten up the atmosphere and calm everybody down by brightening up the restaurant. Also, the floral arrangements had guns in them. The police were going to try to use the big potted plants as sniper nests.
Friends, interjection. I've decided that there should be a name for that when an attractive girl brings you flowers, but she's also considering shooting you with a 7.62. I think we should call it a Shanghai Valentine.
In theory, I'd call that admirably inventive. However, there were two insurmountable obstacles for the police. First was just the tactical geometry of this restaurant, which was laid out like an L. It had a door that fronted the street, and then there was a corner that went back to the play structure, and then there was a door back there that opened into a big Galleria mall. So what this meant was this restaurant was full of too many angled walls for the police to set up effectively on him. Second, the hostage taker just would not converse with them. They brought in a female police officer in a KFC uniform who was hiding a Type 64 pistol in the small of her back. And the plan was to get her to chat her way up close to the kidnapper. She was supposed to go in, try to get him to relax, and then either see if he could enter into negotiations or if she could just plug him. The problem was the guy just wasn't talking. He wasn't emitting any kind of communication or emotion. The only thing that he'd said still was right after he took Ming hostage and said that he wanted food. So with him not talking, there wasn't a way for her to kind of chat her way up and cover her approach to let her little Type 64 do its job. And so again, the police officer decided not to push things and she just backed off and left. The only thing the Shanghai police had going for them was time. The poor little hostage, Min, was now conked out and asleep next to the hostage taker in the hut over the top of the slide. So the criminal was now quiet. He wasn't pressing the action, and by this time, the police must have satisfied themselves that this incident wasn't, say, part of some larger criminal or terrorist ploy. By this point now, a few hours into the standoff, the perimeters had all been set up. I read one report that said they'd actually pushed the outer perimeter out to 500 meters. So now the situation must have felt stable to them, and the negotiators kept things chill. The criminal didn't seem organized. He didn't seem to have a plan, and that was probably good. The TV stations were still broadcasting pictures of him, hoping that his family would come forward and help talk him out. At one point, the kidnapper did finally communicate something. He said that he wanted to leave the building. Well, police loved that idea because even though this guy looked like he might be crazy, he could scarcely have chosen a safer spot for himself. tucked away in that back corner, sheltered by the kid's play structure. So when he demanded a taxi to take him away from the mall, they were all for that. But when the car finally pulled up for him, he wouldn't budge. He wouldn't say anything. He wouldn't go anywhere. Maybe the police had agreed to this too easily, and that made him suspicious. Maybe he had a flash of sanity and realized that if he left the safety of his slide, there were all kinds of bullets that were probably waiting for him outside of those doors. Whatever the case, he wouldn't move. Things dragged on, and at about 7 p.m., police now hit a big setback. Min Min finally woke up. She'd been zonked out for hours, and that had helped to maintain the relatively chill atmosphere of this kidnapping. But now she was awake, and this 4-year-old was getting scared, and that was making the hostage taker agitated. So that by itself moved the police one giant step away from a peaceful resolution toward a kinetic ending. Happily, the police had used the intervening hours really well. They'd finally given up on the nonsense with the flowers and the potted plants at the front of the store, and they began focusing their efforts on the restaurant's rear door around this corner that connected to the inside of the shopping mall. During the afternoon, the police had gone from merchant to merchant, asked them to close for the day, and then they turned off all the lights to the interior of the mall. Now, from the restaurant, you could see through a big glass door into the now darkened interior of the mall. And under cover of darkness, the police had moved a sniper hide up, disguised kind of like a Trojan horse as a big, tall stack of large boxes, like the kind that you'd put a big screen TV in. However, the mechanisms inside those boxes were not made of silicon and chips. They were two carbon-based life forms who were sharpshooters for the Shanghai police. And they had these tricked out Type 79 submachine guns, each containing only one round. So there in their stack of boxes, they waited for hours, one in the standing position, one kneeling, and they crept their hide up to within 15 meters of the bad guy, outside the glass doors to the mall, while the police continued searching for the perpetrator's identity and his relatives, and also working in parallel on solving the next big obstacle, which was the glass door. The sharpshooters could see the perp kind of, barely. They could get fleeting glimpses of his head moving around inside that play structure. But even though they could kind of see him, and he was temptingly close at less than 50 feet, they still couldn't reach him with a bullet without going through this big, thick glass door. So to defeat that obstacle, the police needed a whole separate trick. They sent the police negotiator back inside the store, looking for another round of talks, knowing that this was probably futile. It was touchy too, because the bad guy was now getting more agitated. Min Min was getting increasingly frightened. She was crying, and this was working on the bad guy's nerves. Well, as expected, the negotiators still couldn't elicit any talk from the bad guy and walked out again, this time exiting through the door into the shopping mall. But this time, there were two police officers waiting out in the mall, lying down on the ground, flattened out of the kidnapper's view. And when the negotiator exited the double doors, one of the officers managed to catch the right-hand door and hold it open. The incident commanders kept waiting, though, trying to work the family angle, hoping for a bullet-free solution. At last, though, 7 hours into the standoff, the sharpshooters finally got the order to shoot. And nothing happened. Minutes kept ticking by. They were going to have to shoot through the openings in the play structure. They kind of had eyes on Min Min, the hostage, but it was so hard to tell her head confidently from the criminals. They were both sitting on the decking at the top of that slide under its shelter. And at no time could the trigger pullers see more than just a few inches of head. So, as targets go, this was like shooting half blind into a piece of Swiss cheese. There were a bunch of holes that you could shoot for, but you didn't really know what you were shooting at except by its color. And in a land where everybody's hair is black, that meant they couldn't just aim for the back of a head and drill that. They had to see a face. So nothing happened. Even after the incident commander judged that the kidnapper was finally just too agitated with his crying, frightened child, and he finally released the Kraken and let slip the dogs of war by giving the green light to the shooters, the dogs of war were still sitting inside their TV boxes, waiting and watching as minutes ticked by. People had to have been sweating bullets after 10 minutes of this, with the shooters still not shooting. I would hate to be that incident commander who had waited all afternoon and half the evening and then kept waiting for another 3 hours after the snipers were in place and the glass door had been defeated. How would you like to be that person in charge who delayed so long on permitting this tricky piece of shooting while your madman was visibly getting more and more wound up, only to have him then commit the ultimate evil while you had to watch helplessly because you had diddled around for an extra 3 hours, just hoping for a peaceful outcome instead of dispensing some cosmic justice? That commander must have suffered half a lifetime of slow torture till finally the sniper who was in the standing position saw an identifiable quarter of a face, an adult man, and drilled it right through the forehead. As soon as that shot went pung from the Type 79, this three-man assault team who'd been hiding as close as they dared get to the glass door poured around that corner, and the point man, an officer, Wei, scooped up Mean Mean like she was a little fumbled rugby ball, and without breaking stride, he booked it out the front door to an ambulance that already had the back doors open, and vroom! So there was a happy ending in one respect. The bad guy died, the good girl was unharmed, and her parents actually tried to soothe her by telling her that this whole ordeal hadn't been real, that it had been a movie shoot. I don't think that worked very well, but that wasn't the police's fault. They really pulled out all the stops to get Mean Mean home physically unharmed. And they had done this in a classically PLA way. They'd close the distance to the bad guy using deception, taking as long as they needed to find a deception that worked, and then attacking surgically. Granted, the closest I've ever come to a hostage operation was this time that I got trapped in a window seat next to this banal yoga lady who banged on about Julia Roberts in Eat, Pray, Love and how this breathwork session had changed her life and awakened her Kundalini energy. After half an hour of that tripe, I might have shot myself to escape, but I was rescued and no blood was shed. Nevertheless, here are some unqualified reflections from me on this. First, overall, this whole situation looks so Chinese to me that it should have come with a side of salted pumpkin seeds and a mooncake. First, I'm really impressed that the Shanghai police elected to use a Type 79, which tells me that they have been debugging this thing big time, using all the now available aftermarket options. Remember, this happened in 2007 Shanghai. China had plenty of foreign currency by then, and it was the year before the Beijing Olympics. So China was upping its counter-terrorist capability even more obsessively than ever. If they had wanted an imported MP5, they could have had one. Ian at Forgotten Weapons called the Type 79 something like China's Heckler and Koch. And to me, this incident suggests that the Chinese police agree. No, the Type 79 wasn't a great battlefield weapon, nor was it a superb police weapon in its original military configuration. But apparently, if you remediate it with enough bling from Chinese Tapco, like a chassis and some optics, well, then apparently That basic Type 79 receiver and lock work and the fire control group works well enough at a few dozen meters to provide minute of knife wielding dickhead accuracy. Second, the Shanghai police really wanted to solve this without gunplay. If this had happened in New York City instead of Shanghai, granted, I don't know how long the NYPD would have let this thing play out before they greenlighted the bad guy to get shot. But I don't know, I kind of doubt if they would have given him 7 hours if he were almost 100% uncommunicative with the negotiators. But in the case of the Shanghai police, they were trying to locate the perp's family to get them involved. That is the most Chinese thing since tucking your shirt into your underpants. It is so smart. This guy was a cretin, yes, but what if they had gotten his mom there? How many criminals are so obdurately malevolent that, God forbid, they would actually knife a little girl with their mom watching? Now, this isn't the time for a lecture on Confucian philosophy, but friends, this is a deeply, deeply Chinese example of trying to go with the grain of human nature. Also, very Chinese, in my opinion, was their unflagging creativity in looking for ways to use deception to close the distance to the bad guy. Bringing him flowers and potted plants, that was incredibly bizarre. But then the kidnapper himself was incredibly bizarre. And even though that flower and plant trick didn't work, I say A for effort. Sure, it probably didn't have a prayer of succeeding. The geometry in that restaurant with the corners wasn't right. And did he really deserve flowers? No. But I love the thought process here. Basically, like, why shoot from further away when maybe we could shoot from closer in? Basically, they had a difficult ballistics problem there. They had to reach the bad guy with a weapon in this inconveniently shaped environment. And they must have figured, well, whereas they could treat this as a physics problem, maybe by putting a sniper out in the galleria of the darkened mall on the second tier, like 100 plus miles away, in just the right vantage point, they must have thought, well, wouldn't it be easier instead if instead of a physics problem, we approached it like a psychology problem and mess with the bad guy's perceptions enough to conceal our approach so that we can shoot him on easy mode from up close. And although the flower ploy was pretty low percentage, that was just one of several tactics that they were working in parallel. And I love the chutzpah that led them to say, hey, while we're looking for the mook's mom, why don't we put a female shooter in a KFC outfit? Maybe she could chat him up and look pretty and then draw from concealment and El Presidente his ass with a Type 64. Mwah! I love it. Of course, it's not that only Chinese police would think to use deceit before shock and awe tactics, and it's not to say that, well, American police would just immediately go full Waco. Of course not. The point is not like the obtuse Occidental mind inclines to brute force, whereas deceitful Orientals work circuitously. No. But I do think that in Chinese tradition, these solutions present themselves to the mind first as the obvious go-to. I mean, it's right there in Sun Tzu's Art of War. On chapter 1, page 1, in the definition itself, warfare is the art of deception. 兵者诡道也. So here were the Shanghai police starting out in reactive mode with the bad guy holding all the initiative, and then they retook the initiative just by taking their sweet time, making haste slowly, and boring the guy into a lack of vigilance while they patiently kept their options open and the whole time just worked at different ways of closing the distance to the bad guy with concealment and deception. When an approach didn't work, they didn't bull ahead with it, they just quietly dropped it, and then they patiently beavered away at something else, as long as it took to find a deception that did work and then bloop, attacked surgically. Friends, this has been Type 56, the story of China's army. If you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe. Consider sharing. You might even visit our Patreon page. However, This course remains free for all the world's workers, soldiers, peasants, and SWAT operators. I can't wait to talk to you next time.